The wood stove hadn't worked right in 3 winters. Silas Vance knew this the way he knew everything about the cabin, not because he'd fixed it, but because he'd learned to live around it. 2 extra wool blankets, a sleeping bag rated to -20, an Echo 94 pounds of Belgian Malinois pressed against his left side every night, like a living furnace, the dog's slow breath fogging the frigid air between them. Outside, the storm had been building since noon. By 8 o'clock, it had become something else entirely, a whiteout that swallowed the tree line that turned the porch light into a pale smear and filled every crack in the old cabin walls with a sound like static. Silas sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee gone cold, staring at the envelope he'd been staring at for 6 days. County of Blackwood, final notice of land reclamation. He didn't need to open it again. He had the language memorized by now. Pursuant to Ordinance 7-14B, authorized under the office of Mayor Elias Thorne, failure to vacate by March 1st will result in forced removal and forfeiture of all structures. The Blackwood Ridge Revitalization Project requires revitalization. That was the word they used. What it meant was a ski resort. 48 luxury chalets, a gondola, lift, a spa with heated floors. It meant Thorne's development partners flying in from Denver and Aspen, shaking hands over bourbon, carving up this mountain the way men carve up anything they decide they want badly enough. It meant Silas had 31 days to disappear. He was used to disappearing. He'd spent 11 years getting good at it in Kandahar and Mosul, in places that don't show up on any map the public can access. 4 combat deployments with SEAL Team 8. The kind of service that earns you a folded flag and a handshake and then cuts you loose into a world that has no use for what you've become. He'd landed here on this mountain on 40 acres his grandmother had left him because it was the only place left that asked nothing of him. Echo had come with him. The dog had been his in theater, officially assigned, unofficially inseparable. When Silas rotated out with a Purple Heart and a psych evaluation that went 3 appointments deep, Echo had been retired alongside him. The VA counselor had called it a therapeutic placement. Silas called it the only honest relationship he had left. The storm hit its peak around 10. He felt the shift in his chest before he heard anything, that old familiar pressure, like the atmosphere itself, was collapsing inward. The mug slipped from his fingers, hit the floor. He didn't hear it break. He was already somewhere else. Fallujah. 2007. The courtyard of a house that had looked empty until it wasn't. Martinez screaming his name from the doorway, cut off mid-syllable. The smell of cordite and burning plastic, and something worse underneath something he still couldn't name even now, even here, even with the snow howling outside the cabin window. Echo. The dog was already on him. Both paws on his chest muzzle pressed hard into his sternum, a low, urgent whine cutting through the static in his skull. This was what Echo did. This was what Echo had always done, not the formal task work, not the obedience protocols, but this raw animal insistence, this refusal to let Silas go wherever that darkness tried to take him. It pulled him back, mostly. But tonight something went wrong. He made it to the porch. He didn't remember standing up, didn't remember pulling open the door, but suddenly he was outside in the full teeth of the storm. No coat, no boots, just his thermal shirt and socks sinking into snow that came past his knees. The wind hit him like a wall. He went down. Echo was barking, real barking alarm, barking not the whine she used for his episodes. He could hear her, but he couldn't see her. The cold was so absolute it had stopped feeling like cold. It just felt like nothing, which was worse. He was going to die here, in his own yard. 31 days before they could even throw him off his own land. Then something hit him in the shoulder. Echo full weight, knocking him sideways. She grabbed his sleeve and pulled, and he was too far gone to resist, so he let himself be pulled, crawling on hands and knees through snow that reached his elbows, following 94 pounds of dog by feel alone until his palm hit the rough bark of the old oak. He wrapped both arms around it. The oak was a landmark. He knew where he was now. 20 feet from the door. He could make 20 feet. But Echo wasn't pulling him back to the cabin. She was digging. He heard it through the storm, frantic, purposeful claws, raking through frozen ground at the base of the tree where the roots had heaved the soil into a low mound over the decades. She'd been at this spot before he realized. He'd caught her sniffing here, pawing idly, and had called her off without thinking twice. He hadn't been thinking clearly about much lately. "Echo, come." She didn't come. He crawled to her instead. The hole she'd dug was maybe 18 inches deep, the frozen topsoil giving way to softer earth below the frost line, and at the bottom of it, under a mat of decomposed root fiber and black soil, was metal. He reached in with both hands. It was a box. Military surplus, the old kind, olive drab with a rubber seal around the lid, the kind used for waterproof transport of sensitive materials in the field. He'd handled boxes exactly like this in Coronado during BOO/S. He'd packed gear into boxes like this on the tarmac in Bahrain. He dragged it out of the ground. Echo pressed against him, her whole body vibrating with something that wasn't quite excitement and wasn't quite fear. Silas's hands were shaking badly now from the cold, from the episode, from something he couldn't name. He turned the box toward the faint light bleeding from the cabin windows, and he saw the lid. The seal was intact, military grade, stamped with a classification marking he hadn't seen since his own service days, the kind of stamp that used to make junior officers go quiet. And below the stamp, scratched by hand into the metal with something sharp, a knife maybe, or a set of dog tags. 2 words. Vance. 1976. The cold stopped mattering. The storm stopped mattering. His father's name buried under 50 years of mountain earth staring back at him, like an accusation or a confession or something in between. Silas Vance knelt in the snow with his dead father's name in his hands and did not move for a very long time. He got the box inside. That was the first miracle of the night. The second was that his fingers still worked well enough to break the rubber seal. Silas set the box on the kitchen table under the bare bulb, Echo pressed tight against his leg, both of them still wet from the storm. The cabin groaned around them. Outside, the wind found new angles to push through, new gaps to scream into. He didn't hear any of it. He pried the lid. The smell hit him first. Old metal, dried leather, something faintly chemical like the inside of an evidence locker that hadn't been opened since before he was born, which he realized was exactly what this was. 3 gold bars, small, each one stamped with markings he didn't immediately recognize. Not American military issue. He set them aside carefully, the way you handle things whose origin you don't yet understand. Beneath the bars, wrapped in oilcloth that had held its seal for half a century, a medal. He unwrapped it slowly. Medal of Honor. The real thing, the Navy version, the star pendant on the light blue ribbon, the kind that gets presented by the president, with cameras rolling and generals standing at attention. Except this one had never been presented to anyone. The ribbon was stiff with something dark and old that he didn't let himself think about too hard. Beneath the medal, a notebook. Standard military issue, the kind with the black cover and the red corners. Someone had wrapped it twice in plastic sheeting and taped it with electrical tape that had gone brittle with age but held. Silas opened it. The first 12 pages were encoded blocks of numbers arranged in groups, a cipher system he'd seen variations of during his own service. But starting on page 13, the handwriting shifted. Cramped, urgent, written in plain English like the man holding the pen had run out of time for anything else. His father's handwriting. He knew it from the 2 birthday cards he'd kept in a shoebox his entire life. He read for 40 minutes without moving. The story that came off those pages was not the story he'd been told. The story he'd been told was simple. The kind of simple that gets used when the truth is too complicated to explain to a 7-year-old. Your father was accused of passing classified information to a foreign contact. He died before the court-martial. His name was struck from the record. That's all there is. The story in the notebook was something else. In 1975, Chief Petty Officer Raymond Vance had stumbled onto a weapons diversion, American military hardware surplus from Vietnam, being rerouted through private contractors to buyers that had no business touching American weapons. The operation ran through 3 shell companies and one very prominent family name in Blackwood County, the Thornes. Specifically, Harold Thorne, father of the current mayor, who had used his position on the county procurement board to facilitate transfers worth in 1975 dollars somewhere north of $4 million. Raymond Vance had documented everything. He'd planned to bring it to the Inspector General. He'd buried this box as insurance in case something happened to him before he could. Something happened to him. They didn't kill him, they were smarter than that. They buried him in paperwork instead. Forged communications. A planted contact in his service record. A classified tribunal that was never actually classified, just sealed. By the time it was over, Raymond Vance was dead of a heart attack at 41, and his name had been attached to a treason charge that no one ever bothered to formally prosecute because a dead man couldn't defend himself. His son grew up with that name. Silas sat back from the table. Echo put her head in his lap. He didn't cry. He wasn't sure he still knew how. But something moved through him, vast and slow and tectonic, the way things shift when the ground beneath a belief gives way all at once. His father had not been a traitor. His father had been a witness. He was still sitting there when Echo's head came up off his lap. Her ears went forward hard and sharp. She was on her feet before Silas processed what she'd heard moving to the window in that low, quiet way she had not alarmed, not yet. Assessment. Then Silas smelled it. Gasoline. He had maybe 4 seconds between smelling it and hearing the first window shatter. The bottle came through the east-facing glass, and the fire caught immediately. Dry wood, dry walls, 50 years of dry everything, and the storm outside feeding oxygen through every gap. He grabbed the notebook, jammed it into his jacket, grabbed Echo's vest. The front door blew inward. 3 men. He registered that much in the light of the burning wall behind him. Professional spacing, not county sheriff. Private hire. Echo moved before he gave the command. She went for the leader, the one with the accelerant canister still in his hand, and she hit him at the wrist, with the full force of 94 pounds, moving at speed. The canister went wide. The man screamed something ugly. For 3 seconds, she had him. Then the second man swung. The sound the metal bar made when it connected with Echo's skull was not something Silas would ever be able to describe in language that did it justice. It was the worst sound he'd ever heard, and he had heard things in combat that still woke him at 3 a.m. Echo went down. She didn't make a sound. She just went down. Silas got out through the back window with the box in one arm and Echo's limp body in the other, moving on pure reflex, the burning cabin lighting the snow behind him, orange and gold, while somewhere in the trees ahead, dogs barked in tight closing circles. He ran for 2 miles before he stopped counting. The forest at night in a whiteout is not dark. It's the wrong kind of light, diffuse and sourceless, turning every tree into a shadow and every shadow into a threat. Silas moved through it the way he'd been trained to move through hostile terrain, low, irregular pattern, no straight lines. Old muscle memory. The kind that doesn't ask permission from the conscious mind. Echo was alive. He could feel that much, the faint rise and fall of her ribcage against his forearm, the warmth of her body bleeding through his jacket sleeve. But she hadn't moved on her own since the barn. Her legs hung loose. Her head lolled. He talked to her while he ran. Quietly, the way you talk to someone you're not sure can hear you. Stay with me. You hear me? You don't get to check out. Not tonight. The trees gave him fragments, Mosul 2009. Petty Officer Dennis Ruiz, 26 years old, taking shrapnel in the vehicle ahead of his. Silas had run that stretch of road too, same loose-limbed carry, same desperate arithmetic. If I keep moving fast enough, death won't catch up. Ruiz hadn't made it. The memory came in pieces, like it always did, the dust, the radio chatter cutting to static, the weight of a man who'd stopped being heavy because he'd stopped being there. He shoved it down. Not now. The town of Harlan Creek appeared through the tree line at what he estimated was around 1 a.m. A scatter of yellow windows, a gas station with one working pump, a two-lane road plowed but icing over fast. He knew this town. He'd driven through it to get supplies maybe twice a month for 3 years. He knew the diner, the hardware store, and the veterinary clinic on Marsh Street, run by a woman who'd once taped a note to his windshield offering discounted care for service animals. He'd never gone in. Pride. Stubbornness. The general conviction that asking for anything was a form of exposure. He kicked the clinic's back door in at 1:14 a.m. The alarm started immediately, a high electronic wail that bounced off the tile floors and stainless steel examination tables. He didn't slow down. He got Echo onto the nearest table, got the overhead light on, and was pulling supplies from the cabinet rack when he heard the interior door open. Sarah Jenkins was 38'5'4", and standing in the doorway in a barn coat over pajamas, with a cell phone in one hand and a look on her face that was not fear. It was assessment. The same expression Echo used on strangers. "That's a K9, she said. Her eyes moved from the dog to Silas to the mud and blood on both of them. What happened? It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. Blunt force. Head. She's been out maybe 40 minutes. Sarah crossed the room without another word and put her hands on Echo's skull, careful and precise, running her fingers along the bone structure the way someone does who's spent years learning what wrong feels like. She pulled the overhead exam light down, checked the pupils. "Get me the crash cart. Left wall blue cabinet." He got it. For 17 minutes, neither of them spoke anything except the necessary words, numbers, instruments, readings. Silas had functioned in operating conditions before, not medical ones, but the rhythm was the same. You compartmentalize everything that isn't the task in front of you, and you do the task. The EKG pads went on. The line on the monitor was too thin, too irregular. He watched it the way he'd watched vital signs readouts in medevac situations, with the part of his brain that was still capable of hope and the larger part already preparing for the alternative. Then the line went flat. The sound the monitor made was a single sustained tone, and it hit him somewhere below the sternum, somewhere that had nothing to do with training or muscle memory or 11 years of learning to function through loss. He put both hands on the table's edge. His knees wanted to go. "Stand back," Sarah said. She had the paddles ready. She'd been ready before the flatline. He realized that now she'd seen it coming in the readings. She wasn't panicking. She'd simply been working faster than he could track. "Clear." The jolt went through Echo's body in one sharp convulsion. The monitor screamed its flat tone into the room. Boots hit the front porch. Not one set. 3, maybe 4. The heavy, deliberate rhythm of men who aren't bothering to be quiet because they don't think they need to be. Silas heard the radio crackle through the door, Thorne's contracted security, using county police frequencies, the ones you could buy access to in Blackwood County, for the right donation to the right campaign. The front door came off its hinges. 2 deputies, Thorne's people wearing county badges like costumes. One of them had his weapon already drawn, pointed at the center of Silas's chest. "Silas Vance, warrant for arson and aggravated assault. On the ground. Now." Silas didn't move. He was still looking at the monitor. The flat line held for 1 second longer. Then a single spike. Then another. Ragged, weak, but there, a rhythm fighting its way back from nowhere, one beat at a time. The deputy said something else. Silas didn't hear it. A gunshot detonated inside the small room. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. The muzzle flash lit Sarah Jenkins's face from below as she lowered the weapon she'd pulled from the coat she'd grabbed on the way through the door. And it was not a frightened face. It was the face of someone who had just made a decision and was entirely at peace with it. "Nobody," she said in a voice that carried perfectly through the ringing silence, "is touching that dog." The two deputies stood very still. Men with badges and drawn weapons are accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. Sarah Jenkins had just rearranged that assumption with a single shot, and now they were doing the math the way people do when the situation stops matching the briefing they were given. "You just discharged a firearm at law enforcement," the lead deputy said. His voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I discharged a firearm at my own ceiling in my own clinic." Sarah kept the weapon level, her eyes steady behind it. "Which is my legal right in the state of Montana. And those warrants you're waving around, arson and aggravated assault, issued same night as the alleged incident, signed by Judge Calloway, who has received documented campaign contributions from Elias Thorne for 11 consecutive years. I'm going to want to see the probable cause affidavit before anyone in this room moves another inch." Silence. She wasn't bluffing. Silas could hear it in the cadence she'd built this argument before she walked through the door, the way you load a weapon before you need it. "I'm also going to need you to be aware," she continued, "that this animal is a decorated military service dog, that interfering with a military working dog is a federal offense carrying a minimum 3-year sentence, and that I have this entire clinic on continuous recording that uploads automatically to an off-site server. So whatever Thorne told you tonight was worth, I'd price it again." The deputies exchanged a look. The lead one holstered his weapon. Not because he wanted to, because the math had shifted. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," Sarah said. "Go." They went. The door hung crooked on its remaining hinge. Cold air pushed through the gap. Neither of them moved until the sound of the patrol vehicle faded down Marsh Street and disappeared into the storm. Then Sarah set the weapon on the counter and turned back to Echo. "Hold her steady." Silas put his hands on Echo's shoulders. The dog's breathing was shallow, but consistent, now the monitor showing a rhythm that was weak, but no longer collapsing. He kept his hands flat against her fur and felt the rise and fall of it, counting the intervals the way you count anything you need to believe in. Sarah worked for another 20 minutes without speaking. IV line, vitals check. A careful examination of the skull where the impact had landed, her fingers moving with the particular delicacy of someone who understood exactly how little margin there was between bad and irreversible. "She's going to need imaging I can't do here," Sarah said finally. "But she's stable." The bone held. A pause. "Lucky dog. Thick skull." Silas didn't say anything. His throat had closed. Then Sarah pulled the notebook from where it had slid halfway out of his jacket when he'd leaned over the table, and she stopped. She read the cover, the date, the name stamped on the inside front page in his father's hand. "Where did you get this?" he told her. All of it, the storm, the box, the metal, the gold bars, the 40 minutes reading his dead father's handwriting by kitchen light, while the truth of his entire life reorganized itself around him. He told her about Harold Thorne, the weapons diversion, the forged record, the tribunal that was never real. He spoke without inflection, the way you debrief, because if he let any feeling into his voice, he wasn't sure he'd be able to finish. Sarah read while he talked. She was fast to the kind of reader who absorbs and processes simultaneously, her expression shifting as she moved through pages. When she looked up, her eyes were different. "My mother grew up in this county," she said quietly. "She used to tell me there was something rotten at the center of it, that certain things got buried and stayed buried because the right people had the shovels." She set the notebook down carefully. "This is a federal case, RICO potentially. Obstruction, weapons trafficking, falsification of military records." She looked at him directly. "If this is authenticated, Silas, and I think it can be, it doesn't just take down Elias Thorne. It posthumously exonerates your father. Completely." He'd known that abstractly since the kitchen table. Hearing it said out loud in a clean room under fluorescent light by someone who understood what the words meant legally and precisely, that was something else. He looked at Echo. She was looking back at him, not with the glassy, unfocused stare of a critical animal, with the specific attention she always gave him, tracking his face the way she'd tracked it through 11 years and 4 combat zones, and every 3 a.m. that had tried to swallow him whole. She was weak, her head barely lifted off the table. But she held his gaze, and after a moment, with what was clearly significant effort, she stretched her neck forward and ran her tongue once across the back of his hand. Something in his chest came loose. Not broke. Came loose the way a knot gives way when the right amount of pressure is applied in the right direction. The fog that had lived behind his eyes since Mosul, the constant low-frequency static of a mind stuck in a loop it couldn't exit. He felt it lift, not vanish. Lift. Like weather moving off a ridge, slow and certain and permanent. He was still a man with damage. He would always be a man with damage, but he was also Raymond Vance's son. And Raymond Vance had not been a traitor. He wrapped the fresh gauze around Echo's head with steady hands, checked the knot. Then he crossed to the storage cabinet, took inventory of what was there, and began to make selections with the quiet efficiency of a man who has just remembered exactly who he is. Sarah watched him. "What are you doing?" she said. He zipped the bag, lifted it, turned to face her. "Thorne is hosting his campaign fundraiser tomorrow night," he said. "Live broadcast. Every major donor in the county in one room." He looked at Echo, then back at Sarah. "Best witness list I've ever seen." The Thorne estate sat on 12 acres of groomed hillside above Harlan Creek, lit up like a campaign poster, which tonight it literally was. Silas had surveilled it for 40 minutes from the tree line before he moved. Old habit. In Kandahar, you never approached a structure without first counting exits, guard rotations, and light sources. The estate gave him 3 exits, 2-man rotations on a predictable 9-minute cycle, and enough exterior lighting to be a liability to anyone standing inside it looking out. People in bright rooms can't see into the dark. Echo moved beside him, low and tight, her head still wrapped in a clean bandage under her tactical vest, the one Sarah had helped secure before they left the clinic. She wasn't at 100%. Silas knew that. She knew that. They'd had the conversation the way they always had it, without words, in the 30 seconds she'd spent pressing her forehead against his knee while he knelt on the clinic floor and told her she didn't have to come. She'd stood up and walked to the door and waited. That was that. The broadcast van from a Missoula news station was parked on the gravel circle near the main entrance, cables running through the front door. Live signal. Thorne had invited cameras because Thorne always invited cameras. The man existed in a permanent state of performance, the kind of politician who'd learned to mistake attention for legitimacy. Tonight, that instinct was going to cost him everything. Sarah had spent the 4 hours before this copying the notebook's key pages, digitizing the audio translation of the cipher sections she'd worked through with Silas at the clinic table, and transmitting the package to 3 separate recipients: a federal public defender in Billings, an investigative journalist at the Montana State News Bureau, and a contact at the FBI field office in Helena, who'd given her his personal number 18 months ago after a case involving county property fraud. The information was already out. What happened tonight was not about evidence. It was about the room. It was about Thorne standing in front of his donors and his cameras and his borrowed dignity while the truth of what his family had done played out loud enough that no one in Blackwood County could pretend they hadn't heard it. Silas entered through the utility corridor on the east side at 9:47 p.m. Echo took the west. The broadcast control room was a converted study. 2 technicians, a switcher board, a rack of monitors showing 4 camera feeds. Silas was inside and had both technicians zip-tied to their chairs with their own equipment cables before either of them processed that the door had opened. He sat down at the switcher, pulled the audio feed from his phone, Sarah's clean recording of the decoded diary entries, Raymond Vance's voice reconstructed in his own written words, and patched it into the broadcast signal. On the main monitor, he watched the ballroom feed. Thorne was mid-sentence at the podium, working his crowd, maybe 200 donors, local press, the county commissioner, A state senator Silas recognized from a corruption profile Sarah had pulled. Tuxedos and cocktail dresses, crystal glasses, the whole theater of a machine that had run unopposed for so long it had forgotten opposition was possible. The audio cut in. His father's words read aloud by Sarah, in a clear, flat voice, filled every speaker in the estate. On the monitor, Silas watched Thorne's face. He watched the exact moment the mayor understood what was happening. The slight freeze, the eyes going to the nearest security man, the hand coming up off the podium in a gesture that wanted to be commanding, and landed instead as something much smaller. In the ballroom, heads turned. Phones came out. The state senator set down his glass. Thorne leaned into the microphone and said something about technical difficulties. Nobody moved toward the exits. They were all listening. 4 minutes and 30 seconds into the recording, one of Thorne's private security men found the control room door. He got it open 3 inches before Echo hit the door from the other side with her full shoulder, and he went backward into the corridor wall. She held the door, both paws braced against it, a low, continuous sound in her chest that was not quite a growl, more like a frequency, a warning, the kind of sound that says, "I have done this before, and I am not the one who should be afraid." The man did not try the door again. The recording finished at 9:58 p.m. 11 minutes of Raymond Vance's truth transmitted live to every television in Blackwood County that was tuned to the campaign broadcast, which, because Thorne had promoted it for 3 weeks on every local channel, was most of them. Silas stood up from the switcher. In the ballroom monitor, the room had gone very quiet. Thorne was still at the podium, but he was no longer performing. He was calculating. Silas could see it from 100 feet away, through a security camera, the eyes moving, the weight shifting the hand, dropping below the podium edge. He was already in the service corridor when he heard the glass break. He came through the ballroom door in time to see Thorne with a concealed pistol raised, not at the crowd, not at the cameras. At the back of Silas's head, across the room, the shot lined up before Silas had fully turned. Echo came through the window. Not a door. The window full-speed shoulder first, the glass giving way in a single sharp burst, 94 pounds of Malinois covering 30 feet of ballroom in the time it took Thorne to register the sound and begin to turn. She took his wrist. The shot went into the ceiling. Thorne's momentum carried him backward. Echo locked onto his arm, both of them hitting the low railing of the open balcony at full force, and then the railing gave way, and the frozen river 30 feet below came rushing up to meet them both. He didn't think. Thinking was for situations where you had the luxury of time. Silas Vance crossed that ballroom in 4 seconds, cleared the broken railing in one stride, and went over the edge of the balcony, feet first, into 30 feet of Montana winter night. The river hit him like a concrete wall. The cold was not cold. It was erasure total and instantaneous, the kind that shuts down every non-essential system in the human body within the first 3 seconds of contact. He'd trained for cold water immersion at BUD/S. He'd done it in the Pacific off Coronado in February. None of that training makes the shock smaller. It only gives you a framework to function inside the shock, a set of practiced decisions to run when your instincts are all screaming the same useless word. Out, out, out. He found Echo first. She was fighting the current. He could feel the churning in the water near him before he could see anything in the black beneath the surface, and he grabbed toward the motion and got a fistful of tactical vest and pulled. She came up, coughing legs, working her head above the surface. Alive. Thorne was 10 feet downstream, not swimming. Conscious, barely one hand clawing at a shelf of ice at the river's edge, his formal jacket dragging him under by increments. Silas made the calculation in the time it takes to breathe. The man had tried to shoot him in the back of the head 40 seconds ago. The man had burned his home, ordered his dog killed, buried his father's name under 50 years of fabricated shame. He grabbed Thorne's collar and hauled him onto the ice shelf. He wasn't going to let him drown. Not because Thorne deserved saving, because a dead man can't stand trial, and Raymond Vance had waited 50 years for someone to stand in a courtroom and answer for what they'd done to him. Silas was not going to let that be taken away by a river. He got them both to the bank. He got Echo to the bank. Then he sat in the snow at the edge of the Harlan Creek River with a half-conscious, corrupt politician on one side and a soaking wet Malinois pressed against his other side, and he looked up at the black sky for a long time without moving. Somewhere above them, on the balcony of the Thorne estate, 200 witnesses stood looking down with phones recording. The live broadcast was still transmitting. The state senator had already stepped away from the crowd to make a phone call that Silas suspected was to Billings or Helena or both. It was over. Not quietly, not cleanly, but over. The federal investigation took 4 months. Sarah's package, the notebook, the digitized cipher, the authenticated Medal of Honor, the chain of custody documentation she'd assembled with the precision of someone who'd spent a decade doing public interest legal work, gave the FBI field office in Helena enough to open a RICO case within 72 hours of that night. Thorne was arraigned in March. His legal team was expensive, and his stalling was professional, but the evidence was 50 years old and multiply corroborated, and there was not a jury pool in the state of Montana that hadn't seen the live broadcast. He pled guilty in June to avoid a public trial. Life sentence, federal facility. No parole eligibility for 22 years. The shell companies dissolved. The development contracts for Blackwood Ridge were voided. The 40 acres on the mountain stayed exactly where they were in the name of the family that had always owned them. The posthumous exoneration of Chief Petty Officer Raymond Vance, United States Navy, came through on a Tuesday in early April, signed by the Secretary of the Navy and co-sponsored by both Montana senators. Sarah had driven the process personally, calling in every contact she'd built across 11 years of public interest work. The official record was corrected. The treason charge was struck. His service file was restored complete with a formal letter of apology from the Department of Defense that ran to 4 pages and said in the careful language of institutions acknowledging their failures that Raymond Vance had been a man of exceptional honor who deserved better from the country he served. Silas read it once, folded it, put it in the box beside the medal. That was enough. The ceremony was held on Blackwood Ridge on the second Saturday of May, when the last of the snow had pulled back to the high north faces, and the meadow below the old oak was solid ground again. The whole town came. That surprised him. Not the officials were expected. The uniformed Navy representative, the county commissioner, who'd quietly resigned and then shown up anyway, because this was not a political event, and he seemed to understand that. The whole town meant the diner owner who'd extended him credit twice without being asked, and the hardware store clerk who'd always pretended not to notice when Silas stood in the bolt aisle for 10 minutes, trying to remember what he'd come in for, and the families he'd never spoken to directly, but who had apparently been watching Blackwood Ridge the way people watch something they know matters, waiting to see how it resolved. They stood in the meadow grass under a sky that was the specific deep blue that Montana produces in May, like it's showing off, and a Navy chaplain said words about service and sacrifice, and a junior officer presented the restored Medal of Honor on its proper ribbon, and Silas accepted it with both hands and held it for a moment, before setting it back in the box where it had waited 50 years to mean what it had always meant. Then the junior officer produced a second ribbon, scarlet and gold. The Military Working Dog Valor Award, an official commendation for Echo's actions across the events of that February, documented in full by the Federal Investigation Record and submitted by the Helena Field Office with a recommendation that had apparently moved through channels faster than most paperwork moves through the Department of Defense. Echo sat. She always sat for ceremony that was trained behavior, deep in the bone, the Malinois instinct for precision finding its expression in perfect stillness. The officer leaned down and secured the ribbon to her vest with the same formality he'd have used on any decorated service member. She accepted it with great dignity, then turned and licked Sarah's hand. The crowd laughed. Not the polite kind. The real kind, the kind that comes out of relief, that comes out of a long winter finally giving way. Silas stood in the grass on the ridge his grandmother had left him, with his father's medal in one hand, and the sun on his face for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for. And he felt not happiness, exactly. Not the simple thing the word suggests. Something more like the absence of a weight he'd carried so long, he'd stopped noticing it was there. The way a sound you've tuned out suddenly stops, and the silence it leaves behind is the most profound thing you've heard in years. Echo pressed against his left leg. He put his hand on her head, careful of where the bone had healed, and she leaned into it. "Good girl," he said quietly. She already knew.